Well, now it's my turn to grill Dr. Keener with some questions of my own here on the Bible Backgrounds Podcast with Dr. Craig Keener. Welcome back to another episode of, the final episode of Season 2 of the Bible Backgrounds Podcast with Dr. Craig Keener. Dr. Keener is the F.M. and Ada Thompson Professor of Biblical Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. Craig, I said Asbury Theological Seminary. I think revival with a question mark. Earlier this year, there was it February or March?
February 8th through the 23rd.
Yes.
But it was at the university.
Right, which is
it spilled over to the seminary and local churches and other campuses.
Yes, good. Well, we're gonna get into this, and it's possible our whole conversation this episode will be on this. I do have some other questions here to ask you. Might have to save them for another season. We'll see. So as a external observer to the events earlier this year, when I think of a revival, I think of, at least when we think of the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, these were events that occurred over the course of many years. And so, not that I was someone, I didn't put on any official position, but I've sort of refrained from making a judgment call on whether what happened, on the university campus just a couple blocks away was actually a revival. You've got a different take. If you could tell me a little bit of the details of what happened, and also, do you call it a revival? If so, why?
Actually, Asbury didn't call it a revival. That was placed on it externally, but it was placed on it externally because of the history of what had been called revivals at Asbury. Asbury called it an outpouring of the Spirit, which is good biblical language. Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 10, so it happens more than one time in the book of Acts. It's not called that in Acts 4, but it happens there. Also Acts 13, 52. So it happens a number of times. Corporate experience of the Spirit. And what I wrote for the Roy's report when they asked me to write about it early on, and early on you don't know what the outcome is going to be and so forth. But what I said was some people don't like the term revival. Other people are using the term revival. Who cares what we call it? So here we have Generation Z people experiencing God in a special way, experiencing the holiness of God, people repenting of sins, people getting saved, with a real focus on Generation Z, worshiping God in His holiness. Who's going to complain about that? So the nomenclature is not a big issue. In fact, my question to those who question whether it's a revival, what is a revival? Right. The Bible does not use the term in those ways.
Yeah, fair.
And so it's just a matter of how people, terms mean what people use them to mean. Mm-hmm. That's how we communicate. So
would your objection be more to people who would question whether it was an outpouring of grace?
Oh, yeah. I would definitely.
So your concern is the objection over what happened more than the label that was used.
Yeah, and in history, we speak of different revivals and different awakenings. Sometimes we use the language interchangeably, but like the First Great Awakening, like you said, it went on for decades. On this side of the Atlantic, it was predominantly Calvinist. Second Great Awakening went on for decades. On this side of the Atlantic, it was predominantly Arminian. In fact, the Hebrides revival and the revival in West Timor, they were predominantly Calvinist. West Timor, Indonesia. The Azusa Street revival, from which 500 million Pentecostals and Charismatics come out, that was predominantly Arminian. God doesn't fit in our boxes. He doesn't just pour out his Spirit on people who always agree with each other. This experience of outpouring wasn't around a particular theology. People from all kinds of churches and backgrounds were coming, and in the spirit of unity and awe of God, were respectful of one another's worship practices. So you don't have a lot of people, shouting out in tongues or something, but there were some of us who were quietly praying in tongues there. And there was no problem. We were all there to worship the one exalted Lord Jesus. And with the Second Great Awakening, from the time that Francis Asbury, for whom my seminary is named, from the time that Francis, he wasn't a perfect person, but that's another story. But from the time he got to what became the United States, till the time that he died, the Methodist Church in the U.S., which back then was, right at the heart of the evangelical revival, grew 1,000 times over. That's pretty incredible church growth. But within that broader period of awakening, you have like the Cane Ridge revival, and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ came out of that revival, where it was Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians all gathered together, and that revival lasted about 5 days. But that revival was one of the sparks that was really important to the Second Great Awakening. So the Azusa Street revival went on for a few years, pretty much nonstop. It impacted the church all over the world. It came at a time of outpourings, and these were called revivals by the contemporaries. You had the Welsh revival, I think 1903, Evan Robert, who burned out toward the end. You had, I think 1904, at Pandita Ramabai's orphanage in India. Now, there, the outpouring actually included tongues of fire appearing above the heads of some of the girls, like in Acts 2. The West Timor revival, it would sound like a rushing mighty wind at the beginning of that. And then 1906 to 1908, you had the Azusa Street revival. And as Frank Bartleman, one of the witnesses, said, the color line was washed away by the blood. So I think Jim Crow wasn't as severe in Los Angeles as it was in some other parts, but it was Jim Crow era, and it was led by African Americans. And so, but most college revivals, they usually last a week or two. You have the Haystack Prayer Meeting, out of which came what became the U.S. missions movement, American Baptist Missions at that point. You have the history of the previous Asbury revivals, which usually were about a week. This one was just over 2 weeks, the public phase of it. But the result of it in these previous cases was a whole generation who had a fresh touch from God and were empowered for mission and went out and changed the world. Some of them directly went out to other campuses and spread the fire. So I talked with somebody who was at Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri, and they said that during, I think it was the 1970 Asbury outpouring, the impact of that on the Evangel campus was that the guy who was preparing food couldn't understand why for a week, he was preparing the food and nobody was coming to the cafeteria. They were all in the chapel worshiping God and apparently neglecting their food, which you can't do on a regular basis, obviously, and Jesus doesn't expect us to do it on a regular basis. But so there were major outpourings at Asbury, plus some other ones, but the major ones I think were 1905, I forget some of the other ones, 1950, 1970, and then there hadn't been one to this extent for over 50 years. So this was really significant, and that it came for Generation Z. And each of these, I think, was shaped in a way relevant to their generation. People who came out of these revivals, you've got like E. Stanley Jones, a major mission leader in the early 20th century, major figure in India. You've got from the most recent one before this, you have a leader in Sri Lanka, Ajit Fernando, and one of my neighbors who passed away at the age of 96 a few years ago She was a French professor during the 1970 outpouring. And she said, she worked the night duty to make sure there was a faculty member present so nothing got out of hand or whatever when the students were praying in chapel at night. But during that period, she said you could feel the presence of God blocks away from the campus. Now, I know we don't always feel God, but this was a special time. And at the beginning of this outpouring, I didn't feel anything, except it was just so easy to pray. The February 8th, when we got word what was happening, we came to the chapel, and my son and I spent like 3 hours there. It was just so easy to pray and to hear from God. And I'm working on a Mark commentary and taking notes on what the Lord is bringing to my mind in the Gospel of Mark, how it fits together. But after a few days, even I could feel it. Even across the street on the seminary campus, walking from one building to another, the moment I got outside the building, just this overwhelming sense of God's presence. And after a while, it got so many people were being drawn to it. People were coming to Christ pretty much every day. The gospel, contrary to what some people said online, the gospel was shared. We knew people were coming from outside. And the first day there were people on campus who were converted.
Yeah.
People repenting of sin. Just this sense of God's holiness and awesomeness and His grace. That it's His grace that empowers us to be holy. It's His grace that invites us and heals our wounded hearts. And there were physical healings, I'm told. I didn't witness one while I was there, but I could go on. I see you nodding like, Keener, it's time to...
Well, so one thing I could say is, with revivals, whether we call it a revival, remains to be seen. That it'll take time. We'll see if a movement comes out of this, I would say. I'm not questioning that it was an outpouring, but a formal... Right.
Well, again, that's how you define revival. But
right, exactly.
People were definitely touched.
Yes, and I'm not questioning that.
That's all I'm.
For me, it was more of a semantic thing. When I've learned about American revivals, what were those traits and characteristics? Well, this one doesn't have that yet.
Yeah.
So we will wait and see. And I think if God's going to save this nation with everything that's happening in our society and in the political world, in the educational system, we need a revival. So no doubt.
It has to be God.
Yeah.
So semantics aside, there were naysayers who were saying this is not of God.
Right.
And that I would definitely push back against.
Fair
because
enough,
I was there, and they may have seen a video or something, and they said, "Oh, so and so visited." It wasn't like anybody was barred from visiting. There were tens of thousands of people who visited.
Yeah.
And the overflow space included the 2 chapels of the seminary, the local churches, Baptist, Christian, Methodist / Vineyard, who share a church building. It was everybody was welcome. At least one person did get banned from campus, my understanding, who was known for trying to draw attention to himself. So there was concern to guard the holiness of it, to not let people take center stage except for Jesus. He was the only hero. The person who was preaching in chapel the day that it happened, after chapel, he thought he messed up the sermon. Nobody responded. But then during the worship, the Spirit fell, and people didn't even know. Nobody planned it.
Yeah.
Except, I think the Lord planned it, because of the history of Asbury being open to revivals before, or what have been called revivals, whatever we want to call them. Because of the history of that, they were starting up the intercollegiate, or the collegiate day of prayer, for praying for our campuses in the nation, universities and colleges. And they decided that in 2023, they were going to kick that off from the Asbury University campus on February 23rd, 2023. And some people on campus knew about it, but not a lot of people, because, I mean, there's so many events that take place.
Right.
And February 23rd was still a long way away as far as campus life is concerned. So I know a freshman who was on the committee, and he said, okay, well, I'll pray that God will get us ready. Well, God certainly answered his prayer.
Yeah, right.
But also 50 years of other people's prayers. And so they made that the public, the closing of the public phase. Because, I mean, Wilmore normally has like 6,000 people, less during the summer. And, you know, I moved here from Philadelphia. I had culture shock the first 2 years. You know, we've got 2 stoplights here. But, I mean, lots of cultural diversity, but that's the international students mainly at the seminary, so, and some at the university too. But what, you had times when there were 2 or 3 times as many visitors as residents. There weren't enough toilets in town. The grocery store and the restaurants, they had no food left. And the Salvation Army actually came in and helped feed the people. Salvation Army and Asbury University have close ties. And but the big thing was, it's not about us. So the worship teams, nobody was introduced. They would just seamlessly swap out. When somebody would get up to speak, when the president would get up to speak, he wouldn't be introduced as president. He'd say, "Hi, I'm Kevin, I work here." Because nobody wanted to dare, in God's presence, take the focus off of His holiness. And that was a key feature just in His presence. You know, I was doing guard duty at a door, the doorkeeper in the house of the Lord at the Hughes Auditorium, and just as they were singing "Holy, Holy, Holy," all I could do was just worship God and acknowledge His holiness. And yeah, people make fun of, they say, yeah, singing a chorus over and over and over again. But Revelation 4 says that these living creatures before God's throne, they do nothing day or night except cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord our God." So worthy is He of praise that these creatures are created to do nothing else. Obviously, we're not created to do nothing else. But one of the points Asbury emphasized all along is this is not about Asbury.
Mm-hmm.
This is about God's holiness. You don't have to come here to experience this. You can, but if you do come, for those who did come, take it back with you. And, ending the public phase didn't mean ending everything, but some people have contacted me during the summer. Is it still going on? This is a campus. This is summer. So it's...
Yeah.
Anyway.
Good. Well, thank you for enlightening us about the events that happened and your perception of that and your experience. Thanks for sharing that. All right, here's a question. Did Jesus expect to return in that generation? Mark 13:30. He
probably expected it within a generation, but because he himself says he doesn't know the day nor the hour.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he's guaranteeing it within a generation when he says he doesn't know the day nor the hour. And
in Revelation, he says, "Behold, I'm coming quickly."
Yeah.
So what does quickly mean? Right? There could be different ways of taking that.
Aslan says, "I call all time soon." But also, you have this. Well, a couple things. First of all, is that for already at least 8 centuries, prophets had been saying, "The Lord is coming. Get ready." They'd been saying. They'd been using the language of imminence for about 8 centuries. By now, people understood prophetic rhetoric as saying, "Be ready." Imminence does not mean immediately. And as far as within a generation, it's also interesting that in some apocalyptic literature, a generation could be very elastic. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, at one point they're expecting the generation to be 40 years for the final generation, like the generation in the wilderness. Well, it gets beyond that, and they realize, okay, it's more than 40 years. So the language was already elastic, and people would understand that. I think that's why, well, I think, working on a commentary on Mark, obviously a lot of my Mark commentator colleagues disagree in their commentaries, but I think Mark is writing before 70. And I'm not sure, I mean, Mark doesn't make it so it has to be exactly at the same time, the temple's destruction and Jesus' return. But I don't think Mark is making a big differentiation. I think he's assuming it'll probably happen together. Just like in Joel, you have a locust plague portrayed as an invading army, and in the last chapter of Joel, you have an invading army that's really an invading army. And both are called the day of the Lord because one foreshadows the other. And so you have also with the promises, the prophetic promises of the restoration, you have it coming in phases in Scripture. So you have it coming, the return from Babylon, but not everything's fulfilled. Jesus comes, fulfills some of the other things. Jesus is yet to come and fulfill some of the other things. And if you're premillennial, you have another phase. If you're amillennial, then you're done with it. But anyway, if you're postmillennial, you need to get counseling. Sorry. No offense to my postmillennial friends. But anyway, it comes in phases. But the idea is imminence, and some of it actually does come soon. Matthew and Luke, whom I believe to be writing after 70, see now I've alienated everybody, but if Matthew and Luke are writing after 70, I mean, it's clear that they separate the destruction of the temple and Jesus coming because they recognize, okay, well, some of it's been fulfilled. But instead of looking at it like, whoa, this didn't get fulfilled, maybe it's helpful for us to look at it as coming in phases, which is the biblical perspective. And hey, this did get fulfilled. The temple was destroyed. Supposedly impregnable temple gets destroyed. So if that gets fulfilled, we can be confident about the next phase.
Mm. Next question is on Paul's teaching of singleness. So 1 Corinthians, he has this phrase here that this is him, not the Lord, right? What do we make of that? Is Paul just giving his own personal subjective advice here?
Paul is saying that this particular part of his letter is not inspired. Don't put it into the Bible. No, I'm just joking. Actually, Paul, I think around verse 40 of the same chapter, says, and I think I have the Spirit of God, which is the closest he actually comes to a claim of inspiration, right in that same chapter. But what Paul is doing, this is 1 Corinthians 7, starting with verse 10, section is 10 to 16. Paul quotes Jesus. He says, Jesus says no divorce. You remember how Jesus says, I say, you've heard it said, but I say to you. He says, Jesus says no divorce. And then a few verses down, Paul says, but I say to you. Mm-hmm. Jesus isn't contradicting Scripture. He's explaining it. He's nuancing its message. Right. Paul isn't contradicting Jesus. He's saying Jesus says no divorce. Now, I'm qualifying this for a different kind of situation. If your spouse runs out on you, you're not held responsible for that. And the wording that's actually used in verse 15 is the language used for freedom to remarry, not under bondage. That was used in ancient divorce contracts for you're no longer bound to the marriage, you're free to remarry. So Paul is qualifying Jesus saying, and he's specifically noting the difference between what Jesus said and his interpretation of what Jesus said.
So are you saying here that for, on your view, a person who is a Christian couple, let's say one of the spouses becomes apostate, renounces the faith, that could be warrant for the spouse to divorce?
If they also renounce and leave the marriage.
If they leave the marriage. So if they divorce, right. So if they divorce and the spouse who doesn't want to,
is not held responsible for that.
Yeah. Oh, right. So the Christian spouse can't initiate the divorce proceedings. if their spouse becomes
can't
apostate.
initiate the breakup of the marriage.
Right.
Because back then, if somebody walked out, according to Greek and especially Roman law, which would apply in Corinth, marriage was held together by mutual consent.
Right.
So
So
somebody walks
abandonment.
out,
Yeah.
that was de facto divorce
Yep.
in that culture.
Yeah. Fair. Good. Yeah.
Jewish people, you had to give a certificate of divorce and so on. But yeah, so if the other party breaks up the marriage,
Mhm.
which, the Matthean exceptions in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9 include sexual infidelity, porneia,
Yep.
which some people have tried to narrow that and make it narrower than moikeia, adultery, but actually porneia is a broader term,
Mm.
and nothing in the context qualifies it as being narrower. So, if the person's, sexually unfaithful to the marriage, sleeping around, that's grounds. It's not like you're required to do this. Somebody had a one-night stand, you can't forgive them. It's not saying that, but it's saying, the person is just, well, normally back then a one-night stand would be all it would take, but back then also they thought, Gentiles at least thought in terms of the wife being unfaithful to the husband. Husband couldn't really be unfaithful to the wife in Gentile terms,
Mm.
which biblically we know that's not right. So both genders are held to the same
I know we
standard.
kind of veered off to divorce, but back to singleness. So.
But also with Jesus saying, something important to note here is that people were not making up sayings for Jesus and saying, the Lord says this. No, when Paul quotes Jesus, if he wants to add something to it, he specifically says, no, this is not the Lord.
Yeah.
So
Right.
people weren't just making up sayings.
So as to differentiate from, say, apostolic teaching, versus his own. So it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems there that he's giving his own personal advice.
Yeah, but that's not to say that we should take it as not inspired.
Correct. But it also says, and maybe I'm going to push back a little here, it's sort of like relationship advice, when someone offers you relationship advice. So the text is inspired, no doubt, but do we always have to take relationship advice from people? That's... Sorry if I'm throwing like a bomb here.
If it's inspired, I think you should. But anyway, now, you mentioned singleness earlier.
You're right.
So that raises the question in 1 Corinthians 7, is Paul urging us to singleness, and the higher monastic life should always be
Right.
single. Yeah, I could have made a good monk if I could have handled singleness, actually.
Yeah.
Other factors would
Well, I
be
mean,
better.
as Christian theological development occurs, you do see the monastic movement
Mm-hmm.
looking to this passage and arguing that it's
Right.
the higher road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Paul is also clear.
Those who burn should marry.
Some people have this gift and some people don't.
That's right. Yeah.
But I think it's a lot more who don't than who have it.
Yep.
But yeah, if you have it, don't let people look down on that. Just celebrate it. Or if you have it, well, and you have to have it if you're not married. Paul's pretty clear about that. You just, better to marry than to burn, but you better, marriage is the solution. If you can't marry, which sometimes happens, then you have to find God's grace to stay pure. Paul is really clear on that. But notice the context in which he's speaking. He's talking about 1 Corinthians 6, there's a bunch of Christians who are going out to prostitutes. And presumably these are the guys, because that's what would have been available back then. Male and female prostitutes were normally it was normally guys who went to them in that culture. So part of the problem, maybe the wives are not sleeping with their husbands, but that's not the only reason people did that. So,
Yeah.
but in 1 Corinthians 7, he says, it is good for a man. Now, concerning the things about which you wrote to me, so they're setting the agenda of this.
Don't
Yeah?
you wish that we had that letter? I mean,
But we know what they asked him in this case.
we can
So-
try to piece it, and
so
sometimes clearer than others.
They said it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He says, okay, that's right, but, so we have to keep in mind he's addressing their agenda, just like we keep in mind the culture. Here we have a specific situation. He says, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, but, he says in the next 5 verses, it's a little late now that you're married to decide that. Let a husband have his wife, let a wife have her husband. He makes it mutual. And it was a euphemism. It's documented in ancient sources. Gordon Fee researched that. Having one another means having intercourse.
Mm-hmm.
So husband and wife owe that to each other. Now, he doesn't say that that's grounds for divorce if they don't give that. But he says that they owe that to each other. Actually, in the ketubah, in the Jewish marriage contract, that was actually specified. Rabbis were very practical, and they understood. In fact, they went so far as to say that if a man didn't give his wife intercourse for 2 weeks, he owed her a divorce. Some said for 1 week, but then they made exceptions for certain things, like a sailor is away too long, or if you're a student of a rabbi, that takes precedence.
Yep.
But Paul didn't say that, but he recognizes, he actually calls that a protection against temptation.
Right.
And, maybe at some age, male libido kind of dies down, but the majority of people in antiquity didn't even make it to that age. So he's giving practical advice. And can there be exceptions? He says, if you have this gift, then do it this way. Stay single, so you can just stay focused on God's purposes. But if you don't have that gift, now some people have said better to marry than to burn refers to burning in hell. But if you read ancient literature, it's all over the place. It talks about burning with lust.
This is the passions.
Cupids or Eros's fiery darts,
Yeah.
the passions, burning with passion.
My last question for you is this. Do you have some favorite church fathers, and who are they and why?
I really like John Chrysostom because he's a good exegete. He's a good preacher and a good exegete. Some of them were good homiletically.
Yep.
They were trained in oratory, but their exegesis left something to be desired. I mean, I love Augustine, but he didn't know Greek very well. And
Chrysostom writes in Greek. His corpus rivals Augustine's, but part of the reason why I think Chrysostom's not as influential in the West is because of that reason. He wrote in Greek and getting his works over into Latin.
Yeah. Oh, and I said something wrong about Augustine earlier in the season. I said he was reacting against Manichaeism.
Probably meant Pelagians.
Yeah, the Pelagians.
We'll chalk it up to a misspoken word.
Well, we'll chalk it up to Craig Keener being a New Testament professor rather than a theologian or church history professor. But yeah, Chrysostom, and there are others too. Some of them are pseudepigraphic works. Some of the Syrian church fathers, and like I mentioned earlier in the season, I like Origen and Romans, even though I don't like him on narrative, and some of his theology is a bit hard to swallow. But anyway, yeah. And among Latin church fathers, somebody that Augustine really liked, whose name also begins with A.
Ambrosiaster?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ambrose he really liked. Ambrosiaster, I really like his commentary stuff, even though it's probably well, that's why it's Ambrosiaster.
Yeah.
But Ambrose, he was a good preacher too, like Augustine. But I'm just not really into the allegory stuff.
Although you're not so much into allegory, you say, but also as a New Testament scholar, I mean, you see sort of those theological messages.
Oh, yeah, certainly theological message.
Would fit within that broad category of allegorical interpretation, right?
If you define allegory very broadly.
Very broadly, yeah.
And there's also a difference between homiletical and hermeneutical allegory. So there's one where you're making an illustration based on something, and there's another where you're actually saying the text means this.
Yeah, very good, yeah.
I would make that distinction. I think Paul in Galatians 4, probably adopting his the model of the way his rivals there were arguing,
Yeah.
uses some homiletic allegory. But what he does in 1 Corinthians 10, and this is a good warning to people who say you can't get theology from narrative. 1 Corinthians 10, he says, these things happened to them. So they're not just symbols, they actually happened. And they were written down for us, for our instruction. Similarly, in Romans 15, he says that. Paul gets theology from narrative, learns lessons from how people behaved and how God responded, and especially from patterns of God's working in history. So, a level of typology. Part of the reason I'm allergic to it is the ways I've seen it used.
Right.
Like, you're not going to mess up your doctrine if everything comes down to Christ, even if that's not what the passage means. At least you're going to not preach something false. But when, like what some people did with the tabernacle in more recent times, like the red represents the blood of Jesus, the blue represents the vault of heaven.
We're just ascribing meaning, that very likely was not there in the original intent.
Blue was the most expensive dye available. Red was the least expensive dye available. You use the most expensive dye nearest the ark, least expensive dye furthest from the ark. Why did they use acacia wood? Cedar of Lebanon would have been ideal, like they used for the temple, but acacia wood's about the only kind of wood you can get in the Sinai desert. Why was it structured the way it was? That was the structure of Egyptian temples.
You might get folks, especially those who I've got a buddy who's interested in gematria, and he would argue that there's a higher ordered meaning, that God providentially inspired the courses of human affairs so that all these, as you mentioned, the blue paint and the red, they do have meaning, but the human authors didn't know it at the time. But only looking back, we can see what God meant through it. How would you respond to that?
Sensus plenior. I do think that God can say something there that's beyond the human authors. So that's beyond our normal exegetical approach. But in retrospect, looking back, but we need to be careful about that, because you can make it say anything.
Right.
And prophecy teachers do that all the time. The less sound ones. So, you look at the history. Just take the past 100 years of the reinterpretation of the same passage over and over again. Acts 16:12, is it, or 13? The kings of the East. So that was the Turks, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, before the Turkish Ottoman Empire was dismembered at the end of World War I. Then it was Imperial Japan, end of World War II. No, now it's China, the great red dragon. And then, during the Iraq War, it's Saddam Hussein. The one consistent trait of this seems to be anti-Asian ethnocentrism. To the 7 churches in Asia Minor, these kings that crossed the river Euphrates was the boundary between the Roman and Parthian empires. They all knew what that meant. And people who just read into the text without even looking at what it would have meant to a first century audience are going to, actually Saddam Hussein would have come across the river Euphrates if he had invaded further west. But, the ways people keep recycling the text to fit current headlines, that's not a good hermeneutic. If you're saying, this could fit this could fit that, and so we need to be ready for the Lord's coming. I'm all on board with that, but that's different from what people sometimes do. But with the tabernacle, yes. In ancient Near Eastern temples, the ceiling might represent the vault of heaven. They saw it as exemplifying the cosmic temple of the deity, like Baal's house in heaven, or Marduk Sesagila represented, the heavenly temple. And so, that's not just something Hebrews does, or Philo goes to town with it. He goes too far, but That was already understood in the ancient Near East. But I think we get more meaning from the things that were right there on the surface for an ancient audience. I mean, you go back to the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, which was also true in Egyptian temples. Mesopotamian temples, you might zigzag all around to get there, but you would have something very much like the ark, sometimes with something very much like cherubim. And on top of it, you would have the image of the deity. But there's no image in Yahweh's sanctuary. Egyptian temples, you often had shrines on either side of the main sanctuary for tutelary deities, assistant deities. But none of that, because Yahweh says, you shall have no other gods in my sight. And, other ancient Near Eastern temples, they'd have a bed to put the idol to sleep at night. But Psalm 121, the God of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. There's all this stuff right there in the surface. Mm-hmm. Good theology that God was giving his people. And the very fact that they used the pure gold nearest the ark, and then bronze furthest away, and the most expensive dyes nearest the ark, the least. It was a way in the ancient Near East of showing the holiness of the deity, this gradation of holiness. So it shows that we approach God with awe and reverence. I mean, it's full of theology, but we often settle for this author said that this author said that this author said, and it goes back to some guess that somebody made. And some of the guesses may be right, but let's check it out. Let's do research. I mean, the ancient authors couldn't research modern headlines to figure out what it meant, but we still have enough texts from the ancient world and artifacts from the ancient world to be able to get some of the background.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you for answering my questions and for sharing with us over the course of the season your vast knowledge based on your immensely hardworking ethic that you have in order to be able to churn out commentaries like some here and other books looking at Bible backgrounds. Thank you, Dr. Keener.
Thanks. It's been great to be with you.
If you want to learn more about Dr. Keener's journey, you can look at his treasure trove of resources. Head on over to craigkeener.com. There you can subscribe to his website and find articles, blog posts, videos, and even his cartoons. At his site, you can subscribe to receive email updates. You can also follow Dr. Keener on Facebook, Twitter, and his YouTube channel. But if you want to see the latest videos of the Bible Backgrounds podcast before everybody else does, go to apologetics315.com. At that site, you can see Dr. Keener's video channel, and if you subscribe to his AP315 video channel, you can be entered to win the IVP Bible Backgrounds Commentary New Testament signed by Dr. Keener. After this season is completed, we'll select a winner, so go to apologetics315.com, click on videos, and subscribe to Dr. Keener's channel.